Do you want to start with some good news?
Good news. Um,
I have a video of Mark Carney that I
oh,
saw that I think
okay.
was very
Yeah, go
exciting.
ahead with
And
that. I
so,
think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So let me play this, and I think this could be a good jumping off spot.
We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
Yeah.
I never
Wow.
thought I'd say
Very
this,
well
but
put.
yeah, I kind of want to move to Canada now. It's insane. I've never heard a Western leader speak with such clarity on this
Yeah.
subject.
I agree. Sometimes a sentence falls out of some Western leader's mouth, and he said we get excited, but it never seems to amount to much. Including Trump. Occasionally he says something, or Marco Rubio, but there's never any follow up. And I don't even know if they really understood. Maybe even these leaders misspoke when they said that, or it was a stray thought that just can't happen to tumble out. But that was very coherent, very clear. Extremely well expressed, and it means something because it follows on the heels of this rapprochement with China. And in other words, he is not just saying these things, he's acting on them. It's just like he's looked at the situation and said, look, right, let's stop pretending like the Europeans are, that we're part of this one big happy community, the international community, which imposes these, these rules, these objective rules on the world. Obviously it's not. We saw it happening. We saw other people being abused by the major power, again, under the cloak of this international rules-based order. Now we're being abused, and okay, it's over. We played the game for a while, but we're out of here. So off to China he went, and now we have this speech at Davos. It's quite remarkable.
Right. I also thought just the admission that the rules-based order was always phony to begin with was significant. That he announced like this. We always knew that this was.
Yeah, he said partially false, but it seemed he admitted to it. It sounded like the more he went on, the more that partialness seemed to be a very big part anyway.
Yeah. Well, in my mind, this seems like a huge break in the united front that the West has always been. This idea that we are this bloc and we stick together, and this seems to be the real, to me, a huge break in that dam. That the multipolar world is coming, and there is a leader now in the West that recognizes it and is moving towards integrating into that system. So do you think, or is it just that I've been so desperate to hear somebody speak like this that I'm getting too excited about this statement that Mark Carney said?
I think we should be cautiously optimistic. I'm sure there's going to be a great deal of opposition within Canada. And Canada still has a very, very powerful neighbor with all kinds of levers. But I think this is highly significant. Again, it just, as we're just saying, the clarity, with which he spoke, and the fact that he's backed it up with actions. And we're not talking about a minor country. You can point to Viktor Orban or Fico, But the thing is, they are the leaders of really small countries that really can't make a difference, and may eventually be crushed by the EU. Canada is a member of the G7. This is very significant. I think. We got to continue to watch this guy. This is a surprise.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm looking for is for other countries to follow suit, because he speaks with such clarity. I think other leaders have to recognize that there's some truth to it. And it's coming with this on the backdrop of Trump, trying to take Greenland and threatening, 7 European countries with more tariffs. And just the way that he speaks to everybody is just so rude. I just think on a personal level that people are just done. And so I
should hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think then that we can start to see some more countries in Europe maybe grow a little bit of a spine and take a pragmatic approach like Mark Carney?
I don't know. You would think so. Actually, I heard the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, being interviewed, and he was just talking about the spinelessness of the Europeans and how it was just, frankly, almost revolting. And he said, come on, people, grow a spine. This is, obviously this constant groveling hasn't helped you. Stop groveling and stand up. And I think many of us are thinking the same thing. There have to be people in Europe that are thinking that. But at the same time, I was looking at some clips from some of the other speeches at Davos. For example, Mark Rutte. It says, okay, yeah, we can talk about Greenland, but above all, Ukraine. And we've heard Kaja Kallas say the same kind of thing. And, I think quite a few of them are just, their main concern is that that Project Ukraine, will lose U.S. support. It's already lost a substantial share of it. And I think that's quite significant. I think that may be fatal, but they're afraid that it's going to lose all of it. And so I think quite clearly, in my mind, people like Mark Rutte and Kaja Kallas, they are willing to sacrifice Greenland. They say, okay, let him have Greenland because we just need to keep him on board, keep on his good side. I would think probably the majority of European leaders are going to do the same. It's just because I've been following these clowns for years now, and I just don't think they have it in them. Now, I hope we get a surprise,
But they honestly think that they can, if they give up Greenland, then Trump will just go all in on Ukraine. I mean, this is what's so crazy about the Ukraine war is they don't seem to have a plan. Like, what's the objective? You to start World War III? I mean, even if you did, like we said, even if somehow we go all in and we push the Russians back and march on Moscow, well, then, then they engage their nuclear doctrine and then the whole world ends. So there's no way to win here. So I just don't understand what they're hoping for. What's going to happen is they'll lose Greenland, and then Ukraine is already lost, essentially. They don't have power. The electricity's out. So what you think that's really what they're thinking? They think that the U.S. is just going to come bail them out?
I don't think they're thinking much at all. That's the problem, is they're not really thinking strategically. They're just responding emotionally, but they are emotionally committed to it. And they just can't, it's, again, Putin is Hitler, and if we let him take Ukraine, he's going to come after, the Baltics and Poland next. It's something that they've convinced themselves of. And it just says, we can't appease them. It's just morally unacceptable. We have to stick with Ukraine to the, as long as it takes. Right. And they just haven't budged from that. I don't think they're really capable of it. Well, maybe they are. One thing you see, like within Ukraine, you had a lot of very brave people. I think I mentioned one journalist, but others are coming out now that they've spent nights, cold nights in their apartments. You say, well, I think there was a member of the RADA who said this. It was just like, it used to be easy, to think about it because we were insulated from the reality of war. And it was just, it was something that we could make brave statements about. And now that we're shivering in our apartments, it's different, isn't it, my fellow members of the RADA? So I think the reality is coming home in Ukraine, but I don't know that it has, and maybe some of that will get through to the European leaders. Again, they don't have a plan. I know nothing is going to work. It's just a kind of a question of how fast they're going to lose. And again, the U.S. has withdrawn a lot of support. I was just looking at a chart of funding for the Ukraine war, that showed both the U.S. support and European support. And there was a tremendous amount of support, kind of that came at the end of Biden's term, and that continued afterwards because all those funds had been allocated already. But then it dried up, about halfway through last year. And the Europeans made an effort to compensate for that, for the shortfall. And so through the summer, they were able to send a lot of funds. But then you see in the fall, it drops off sharply. And Ukraine is getting just less money, and I'm sure many fewer weapons too than it has throughout the war. So right there, it's already a massive crisis, a looming catastrophe. But still, the U.S., provides the intelligence and the satellites. I'm sure that I know that weapons are still getting through there. So they are playing a role, and it's not a role that will actually lead to victory for Ukraine. That's clear, but they can maybe extend the war maybe another year. I don't, and just during that time, I know it doesn't make sense, but in that time they're not thinking rationally; they're just hoping for a miracle. But they understand that it's just over immediately if the U.S. withdraws now, and so this is their plan: keep the Americans in. That's not really much of a plan, but keep the Americans in. They'll blow up our pipelines, take our land, and whatever, but keep them in.
Yeah, well, it just seems like if major cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, all the major cities in Ukraine can't keep the lights on, these people are freezing, it's the middle of winter, then to me that is the death blow. How can you sustain a war when you don't have electricity, a modern war?
Yeah, no, it's hard. Yeah. Of course it means suffering for the civilians. That's what we talk about right now. The lights are off, the heating is off. But it also has a huge impact on the war, on the military side of things, because again, the various workshops and factories cannot churn out weapons. The trains can't run, so logistics gets shut down or is greatly impeded. Yeah, it becomes very, very difficult to wage war. And it seems like the Russians have taken it to that point now where they could shut the whole thing off very quickly. There's some fears, a discussion within Ukraine is that next they'll go for, not the nuclear power plants themselves, but for the substations that are connected to those nuclear power plants, because virtually all of the power that Ukrainians that remains in Ukraine, is being generated by those nuclear power plants. And if they take those offline, that's it. There's nothing. And
right. Yeah, and I think when you don't have power, any illusion that people may have that somehow they're going to win this war starts to evaporate quickly. You can't turn the lights on in your main city. Just think about it in the U.S. If all of a sudden a city like New York or Washington, D.C. can't keep the lights on, people know, this is the end. It's over. Yeah, it feels right. Every part of your life is now being affected. You can't hide from it. No amount of propaganda is going to tell you otherwise, that things are okay and we're going to turn things around. Things have been getting steadily worse, and now you can't even stay warm in your own apartment. Can't cook food. You can't, the railway station doesn't work. You can't read a book at night unless you have candles. I mean, people know. So, and then the other thing as well is just because Trump has just gone completely crazy and going on this Greenland route is that Ukraine is getting pushed out of the news. Even though it's in its most dire situation ever. But now people are talking about Greenland. This is the crisis now. So I think what's going to happen is that if the Europeans really think that giving Greenland will bring Trump back in on the Ukraine project, I think they are completely delusional. I think Trump is going to take Greenland. It's kind of Ukraine is out of the news. Ukraine's going to lose this war probably pretty soon, the way things are going. And then Trump will just say, like, look, well, we stopped Russia from taking all of Ukraine. And so we have a victory there. And look what we got, America. We got a landmass the size of Mexico, right here. Now we look how powerful we are. Look what we've done. So it's going to be he's going to paint it as a huge victory. And the Europeans are just going to have nothing. Destroyed economy, no infrastructure, no energy, and they lost Greenland, and they lose the Donbass and probably half of Ukraine. Kiev and Kharkov and Odessa are going to go too.
Yeah. No, it's a disaster for them. And it's one that was, not that I expected Trump to take Greenland, but but otherwise it's just very, very easy, predictable. We could see it coming.
Right. So it's amazing when you say that you think the Europeans will just kind of play ball with America after everything we've done.
Yeah, well, I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, the statements that they're making. The one person who struck a different note, of course, was Carney. The Canadian Prime Minister. But every clip that I've seen from speeches given by European leaders is telling me that these people are still hopeless. They are hopeless. They're not. They're just not incapable of removing themselves from this. This delusion that they've really embraced.